Well, thank you. I don't know how many of you were on the last talk about reducing the abortion rate. This talk will be a bit more about the science behind abortion, behind the development of the baby in the womb, and also about how abortion impacts women in particular. So I hope that this is helpful for you. As we spoke a little bit about last time, there's a lot of pressure in Nigeria to promote abortion, to legalize abortion. I think I mentioned last time that even the Lagos Ministry of Health put out guidelines for performing abortions maybe a year or two ago, and it was only repealed after it was quite clearly pointed out that this was against the law of Nigeria. And so there's really significant pressure. We know that the Ministry of Health in Nigeria and its different states are often corrupted, and there's a lot of money being poured into Nigeria to promote it. We even know, in fact, that one of the methods used by foreign governments to combat the persecution of Christians in Nigeria is actually to promote abortion among Muslims in the north of the country. So, whatever, of course, all of us as Christians, especially, are against persecution, and we are all horrified at what has been happening to our brothers and sisters in many parts of the country. But the idea that ending the life of innocent babies of Muslims is an answer to this is really something that should horrify us to the same degree. And so this is something that is really, really important for us as Christians to understand the value of life that God has given, the image of God that babies are created in, as well as women, their mothers, and to think how can we respond as Christian doctors and medical professionals, dentists, and so on. And so I really hope that we can think through this and that we can begin to advocate as doctors and other medical professionals in Nigeria in response to this. And so I want to share the science behind that and the impact of abortion on both the child and their mothers in this presentation. So as you can see from this map, Nigeria is in red, which means that it does not allow abortion. And this means that it is in the majority of countries in Africa. So red and yellow countries do not allow abortion except in extreme situations. So Nigeria is actually in the majority of countries around the world that do not allow abortion on demand. It allows abortion only in extreme circumstances, along with most of Africa, the Middle East, most of the Islamic world, the Caribbean, the Pacific, and much of Latin America as well. So, how can we think about this? Well, Martin Luther King Jr. said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. He said, whatever affects one person directly affects everyone indirectly. What he meant was that if injustice occurs, it doesn't just affect the victim. It actually hurts all of us because we were created to be in a community and a society and a family. And nobody knows this better than the parents of a child. Any parent knows that when their child is hurt, they hurt as well. That is just what it means to be a good parent. And so the same principle is true when it comes to abortion. The pro-life perspective just says the same thing about abortion. It says that when an unborn child is hurt, their mother and their family and their community hurts as well. And I'm going to share some of the empirical evidence which demonstrates that. So, what does justice actually mean? Well, it means firstly treating people equally with dignity. And as we will see later in the presentation, the pro-life perspective or the Christian perspective is really just about equality. It says that every human life is equally valuable and deserves the same level of protection, no matter how big or small you are, no matter which biological sex you are, no matter what race you are, no matter how independent you are, no matter how strong you are. It says every human being is equally valuable and deserves the same protection. But it also means that we have to fight for equality in society generally and restore relationships. Because, as I said, when unborn children are hurt, their mothers hurt as well. And part of justice is restoring the relationship between the mother and the child, and between the mother and the rest of society, especially when the rest of society has abandoned her or has mistreated her or has left her to deal with something that she cannot deal with alone. So there's often this narrative that abortion is a debate between the mother and the child. And if you support the mother, you're pro-choice. And if you support the child, you're pro-life. And you have to pick sides. But as Christians, we should reject that narrative completely because we know that actually both of them are infinitely valuable and that abortion is harmful to both. We should not need to put the mother against her child as if they are in conflict, because it is a mother and a child, and both of them deserve support. And when one thrives, they both thrive. So the pro-life perspective says that both of the lives in a pregnancy are important, and it says that women deserve better than abortion. So in my country, there are 200,000 abortions every year. This means that 1 in 3 women in their lifetime will have an abortion. That means that not only are 200,000 lives lost to abortion in my country every year, but 200,000 women are also hurting from the loss of a child every single year. Around the world, there are maybe 50 million abortions a year, which means that 2 babies are aborted every single second around the world. Now, we know that in pro-life countries, the number of abortions is significantly lower. So in Nigeria, the abortion rate is significantly lower, but it still happens and it is still a common experience. And therefore, we have to speak about this issue not only with truth, because truth is essential, but also with grace and compassion, because as the book of John says, chapter 1, Jesus came with truth and grace, filled with those from the Father. And so our response has to be the same, being filled with both truth and grace when it comes to this topic. So how does the Bible talk about this? Well, in biblical times, they didn't know about the exact process of fertilization. So the Bible strictly doesn't say that life begins at fertilization because they didn't know about fertilization. What that shows is that life beginning at fertilization is actually a scientific idea. It didn't come from religion in the first place. It was actually a scientific discovery. So what this means is that everyone can agree that life begins at fertilization, whether they are Christian or Muslim or atheist or something else. This is simply a scientific fact, and we will see that later in this talk. But the Bible does confirm that life begins in the womb, and it does talk about conception. And so it says that life is valuable from conception, meaning from the very beginning. As soon as a human being is created, the Bible suggests that life is created in the image of God and is valuable. And so you could often tell someone's perspective on abortion by looking at the way that they talk about the unborn child. Pro-choice or pro-abortion people might call it a parasite or a ball of cells or something like that. And pro-life people will often call it a baby or a child. So we can look at how the Bible speaks about the child to see how God thinks about it. And the Bible is very clear. It uses the Greek word brephos, which just means infant or child. And so it uses the same word brephos for the unborn baby, John the Baptist, and the same word for the newborn baby, Jesus, in the manger. And you can see a picture of that represented in this picture. It goes even further. In fact, later in Luke's gospel, well, firstly, it says in Luke's gospel that John the Baptist, as an unborn baby, leapt for joy, jumped for joy in the womb because of the coming of the Savior, which shows that, especially at this Christmas time, as we remember the birth of our Savior, the Bible shows that one of the first people to recognize and rejoice at the coming of a savior was, in fact, an unborn child. In fact, the first people to recognize it were a woman, the mother, and an unborn child. And of course, Jesus himself was an unborn child. And so, as we think through Advent in these next few weeks, this is exactly the time that we remember Jesus himself being an unborn baby in his mother's womb. And so later in Luke's gospel, it says that they were bringing infants to Jesus so that he might touch them. And the disciples said, "Go away, Jesus is too important for these babies." But Jesus said, "Let the children come to me and do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of God." Now, the exact same word brephos is used in this passage. So the same word used for an unborn baby and for a newborn baby is the same word where they were bringing babies to Jesus, and he said, "Let them come to me and do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of God." And so this is just an illustration of the great care and compassion and importance that God has for the unborn child, created in his image. Of course, Psalm 139 is the most explicit description of this. It says, "You formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made." Later in that psalm, it even explicitly says, "Your eyes saw my unformed substance." What does that mean? Well, in the ancient world, they divided pregnancy into two halves. They said at the beginning, it doesn't really look like a baby and it's unformed. And then later in pregnancy, the baby looks more like a baby and is formed. Well, what the Bible is saying is even when the baby was not formed, before it looked like a baby, God still saw that baby and still recognized it and had written out for that child the days ahead of them. So it suggests that from the very beginning of pregnancy, as soon as the baby exists, not just when the baby is in the second trimester or the third trimester, it says from the very beginning, this is a human being that is valued by God, and God has a plan for you from that time. And therefore, from the very beginning, Christians had two responses to abortion. Now, in the Roman world, abortion was perfectly acceptable and infanticide was perfectly acceptable. So if the baby was born, you could still kill that child if you met certain conditions. So abortion and infanticide were seen as the same thing, and they were widely accepted. And Christians came along and said, no, we agree that the child in the womb and the child outside the womb are the same. But both of them are valuable, both of them were made in the image of God, and we have to protect both. And so they came from the very beginning with truth and grace. They said, firstly, we have to have legal protection for the child. And so one of the first things Christians did when they got political influence is to prohibit legally abortion and infanticide. But at the same time, they said we have to have grace as well. And so there are many women in these situations who cannot look after a baby. And so they said we have to respond with practical support and love for the woman, the father, the child, and the whole family. And so they said this is what being pro-life looks like. Not just looking after the woman, not just protecting the baby. Being pro-life is about both together. And if you don't have one of those halves, then you're not fully pro-life. Now, I said at the start that I would share some evidence about abortion's harmful impact on women, and so I want to take some time just to go through a few of these ways. The first is sex-selective abortion, which means that a baby is aborted just because they are the wrong gender. So usually, and pretty much always in fact, this is because the baby is a girl. And so it's estimated now that there are nearly 2 million abortions of baby girls every single year just because they are girls. And if they were baby boys, they would have survived. So what this means is that abortion has become one of the most powerful weapons to eradicate the voice and the visibility and even the very presence of women in society. This has downstream consequences because not only do you have millions and millions of missing girls and missing women as a result, but because there are so few baby girls born in some parts of the world, it causes a rise in sex trafficking and bride trafficking. Now, think about it. In some villages in India, there are no baby girls born. There is not a single baby girl in some villages in India. So the boys grow up and they become men, and then they have no women to marry and have children with. And therefore, as a result, sometimes they respond by kidnapping and trafficking women from other parts of the country or even other countries so that they can have people to have families with. Now, this is wrong. It is human trafficking. It is kidnapping. It is often slavery if the woman becomes a prostitute, especially against her will. But this is the downstream consequence of sex selective abortion. And it means that even the girls who survive abortion end up becoming the victims very often as a result of this industry. Now, the second way that abortion is harmful to women is because so often it is forced on a woman against her choice. We often hear this narrative that you don't have to agree with abortion, but you should let it be legal because it allows people to have choice. But this is very simplistic because abortion is very often not about real choice. In fact, it's estimated that a quarter of abortions are forced on a woman by somebody else, by her parent, her partner, a pimp, her employer or teacher, or the doctor or the abortion provider in some cases. That's a quarter of abortions, which means that millions of women have abortions forced on them by somebody else around the world every single year. But not only that, the majority of women actually do not have a real choice because the majority of women say, if I had the right circumstances, I would want to have my baby. But I'm forced to have an abortion by my circumstances because I know that if I have a baby, I will lose my job, or I won't get promoted, or my parents will be angry, or my partner will leave me, or something like that. So the majority of women having abortions do not feel like they have a real choice. And this completely destroys the argument that this is just about choice, because the reality is far more complex. But in fact, we know that the problem is worse because the abortion industry actually pressures women to have abortions because they make money from it. Now, this is very well known that there is a lot of population control efforts in Africa, particularly in Nigeria, that there are governments and foreign NGOs and many entities which are pouring millions and millions of dollars into the country to try and reduce Nigeria's population. Well, part of the reason for that is that Nigeria is on track to become the third largest country in the world by population. And this, to some countries, is seen as a threat. It's not, of course, because children are the future and Nigeria is a thriving country and it will have great prosperity as a result of the people. But this is a threat to many countries around the world. And so they pour money into organizations which deliberately try to reduce the population of Nigeria, as well as many other countries, particularly in Africa. Well, this is a report from the hospital regulators of the UK. And it's a report on Marie Stopes International, which is one of the few biggest abortion providers in the entire world. And I'm sure they have a significant presence in Nigeria. Well, in fact, what they found was that there were staff paid bonuses if they performed more abortions. So if a woman had an abortion, the staff member would be paid a bonus because they wanted to perform as many abortions as possible because that is how they made money to put into population control in Africa. And so they had a target that 98 to 100% of women in the clinic should have an abortion. And if they didn't have an abortion, that was seen as a failure. They even said that consent was routinely accepted from children without proper assessment of their ability to understand the risks. Of course, as medical professionals, you will know that if someone does not give informed consent, they do not give valid consent. And so abortions were being routinely performed on children without telling their parents and without getting valid consent. So this is coerced abortion and it is a human rights violation. This is a particularly harrowing example from a hospital in the UK. This was actually an Igbo woman from her family was from Nigeria, and she was in her 20s and she was 22 weeks pregnant. Now, this means that in the UK, if she had given birth at that very moment, there is a good chance that the baby could have survived. The baby might even have been viable. But because the woman had a learning difficulty, the doctors said, you have to have an abortion. Now, the woman's mother was a midwife who said that she would be happy to help look after the baby. The social worker who had assessed the family said that the family is capable of taking care of the baby. They should be able to have it. But the doctors said, we think you have to have an abortion because you have a disability. And therefore, because the woman refused, the doctors took this woman to court where the judge said that the evidence indicates the woman wants to keep the baby, but an abortion should still be carried out because this woman had a disability. They even said to try and placate the woman to appease her because she didn't want an abortion, she would be given a new doll to play with after the abortion instead of her baby. Now, fortunately, the night before the abortion was scheduled, this woman managed to get fundraising from other sources to challenge the judgment, and the appeals court overturned the judgment, and she did not have to have the abortion. But she was hours away from being forced to have an abortion, and we know that there are other situations like this where the woman has not raised the money to challenge it and has been forced to have an abortion against her will. So the next way that abortion is harmful to women is the impact on a woman's mental health. Now, it's often said that you need to give women abortions because if you don't, they will have all sorts of psychological problems and suffering and mental health difficulties as a result. But it's actually widely agreed, pretty much universally agreed, that there is no evidence for this. So this was the world's leading researcher on the topic, Professor David Ferguson from New Zealand, and he was pro-choice. He said abortion should be legal, it should be allowed, but we have to be honest about the medical evidence. And he said at the present time, there is no credible scientific evidence demonstrating that abortion has mental health benefits. In fact, he actually found the opposite. He found that a woman who has an abortion, compared to a woman who continues an unwanted pregnancy, the woman who has an abortion has a 30% increased risk of anxiety, a 70% increased risk of suicidal behavior, a 130% increased risk of alcohol abuse, and a 300% increased risk of drug abuse. And we also know that post-traumatic stress disorder is another very common complication of abortion. But what about women who do not have the abortions and who are forced to keep their baby? Are their lives ruined as a result? Well, no, not only do they have lower rates of mental health problems, they actually say that they were glad they had the baby in the end. So this was a study of hundreds of women in the US, and these women went to get an abortion. They clearly wanted an abortion, or at least they went to get one. And they were refused an abortion because they were too far advanced in their pregnancy. And so the researchers followed them up to see, firstly, did they have the baby in the end, or did they go and get an illegal abortion or go to another country? And secondly, how did they feel afterwards about being denied an abortion? Well, they found that over 70% of the women who were refused an abortion ended up keeping the baby. So this is proof that pro-life laws do work. Many people and international organizations will tell you that pro-life laws do not work that women get abortions anyway because they're desperate, and therefore you might as well make it legal. But this is fundamentally not true. We know, as I explained in my last lecture, that the majority of women who are denied an abortion will go on to have the baby. So pro-life laws make a huge impact in reducing abortions. But how did the women feel afterwards? Well, they asked women at 6 months, at a year, 2 years, and 5 years after being denied an abortion. And when the child was 5 years old, they interviewed the woman and they said, "Do you wish you could still have an abortion?" And 98% of the women who kept the baby and raised the baby said no. 98% said they were glad they had their baby and they do not wish they could still have an abortion. So the reality is that women do not need abortions in these situations. What they need is time and support and compassionate care in those situations. And if they are given that, then they do not need to end the life of their child. In fact, they can thrive along with their child. Now, as a result of this, particularly because of the suicide rate after abortion, the overall risk of mortality after an abortion is significantly higher than after childbirth. These data are from Finland in Scandinavia, where abortion is very widely accepted and supposedly very safe. And yet, the mortality rate, the risk of dying after abortion, is triple the mortality rate after giving birth. And this disparity is even increasing over time. And there's a number of reasons for that. Well, we also know that abortion can cause preterm birth in future pregnancies, which you will know causes many health problems in future for the mother and for the child. We also know that when abortion is legalized, there is a massive increase in sexually transmitted diseases. Now, this is not because abortion itself directly causes sexually transmitted diseases. It's because when you legalize abortion, people have more sex with more different people. They become more promiscuous because they feel like they have a backup option if they get pregnant. And so many countries around the world have shown consistently that when abortion is legalized, there is a huge increase in sexually transmitted diseases. For example, there's usually something like a 60% increase in gonorrhea transmission. And this, of course, has many consequences for women in particular, like pelvic inflammatory disease, ectopic pregnancies, miscarriage, premature labor, and so on. In many parts of the world, including Nigeria, there is also the increase in HIV, leading to AIDS, and of course, the huge problems that result from that, in particular, making maternity much more dangerous. And so this is a huge public health problem in the West and in many parts of the world. And a huge part of this is specifically caused by abortion. As an example, South Africa legalized abortion in 1996, and their maternal mortality tripled in the following years. And a lot of that was because of a huge increase in HIV transmission and AIDS as a result, causing a huge increase in maternal mortality. And a big part of that was because of the legalization of abortion. Another thing that happens, well, when abortion is legalized is this increase in promiscuity and this decline in responsibility and commitment. So when abortion is legalized, the man can simply say it's your body, your choice, and your responsibility. And therefore, I'm going to walk away and not take responsibility for this child when you've become pregnant. So what that means is that because there is a lot more promiscuity, there are many, many more pregnancies, and particularly unwanted or unplanned pregnancies. But the woman has to deal with the consequences of that by herself. The man can simply walk away and say, if parenthood is optional for you, then parenthood is also optional for me, and I'm having nothing to do with it. So rather than liberating women and making them freer, it has actually caused them a lot less freedom and more captivity because women are the ones who pick up the pieces in these unplanned pregnancies. And this has a particularly negative impact on poorer women because they are the ones who are most dependent on having a father as a second source of income and support when there is a baby. And so this is what America has seen. What they found from a Nobel Prize winning economist was that in 1970, poverty was about to be eliminated in America. But just as they were getting rid of poverty permanently in America, there was a massive increase in single motherhood and the feminization of poverty. What they mean is that women were going into poverty specifically because they were the ones who had to deal with a pregnancy by themselves as a result of legal abortion. So abortion did not make women freer to earn money, to end their pregnancies, to be independent. It actually made them far more dependent and gave them far more responsibilities and burdens unequally. And this family breakdown causes many other problems. It causes mental health problems, crime, violence, drug abuse, and so on, in addition to poverty. And so, as I said at the start, this doesn't just affect the baby and the mother, this has consequences throughout the whole of society. Everyone misses out and everyone is worse off when these children are harmed. So I want to close just by sharing a few statistics about abortion and then a bit about the science behind life and when life begins. So in my country, as I said, there are 200,000 abortions every year, which means 1 in 3 women in their lifetime. And only a tiny proportion of these are for extreme reasons. At most, 100 are to save the life of the woman. That is far less than 0.1%. About 0.1% are due to sexual violence in Florida, where we have data on that. And about 1.5% are because the baby has a disability. And this means that 98% of abortions are for social reasons or economic reasons. This can even include sex-selective abortion. So in my country, you can have an abortion for any reason at all, up to 24 weeks or 6 months, even past viability of the baby. If the baby is disabled, you can actually have an abortion up to birth or even during birth in my country. So I won't go into the methods of abortion, but I want to talk about the ethics of abortion and when life begins. Well, we already talked a little bit about the biblical perspective, but we also want to talk about this from a human rights perspective and a secular or interfaith perspective. And we can do that by beginning with international human rights law. And in international human rights law, which Nigeria is a signatory of this treaty, it says every human being has the inherent right to life, and this right shall be protected by law. So it says, firstly, that every human being has the right to life, not just some human beings. And it doesn't say that this is just something to aspire to. It's not just a nice idea, but this has to be protected by law. Human beings need legal protection if they really are human beings. And so the fundamental question here is the unborn child or the embryo or the fetus a human being? If it's not, then maybe it doesn't matter. But if it is a human being, then it has the inherent right to life and must be protected by law. Now, let's be clear. I'm not talking about a potential human being. I'm not talking about a potential life. We should stop talking about that idea completely. I'm asking, is this an actual human being in development? And the science is actually very, very clear, but we have to be a bit specific about what we're talking about. Because skin cells are alive, but they're not human beings. They don't have a right to life. Bacteria are alive, but they are not human beings and they don't have a right to life. So what are we actually talking about when we talk about the right to life? Well, we can answer that question by saying, what are we? We are human beings and we have the right to life because we are individual members of Homo sapiens. We are individual organisms in the human family. And so the question is the unborn child or the embryo or fetus an individual human organism in our species? And when we clarify the question, the answer also becomes clear that an individual human organism begins at fertilization when the sperm meets the egg, and therefore there is an entire genetic completeness such that from that moment, the only thing that is needed is time and the right environment and nutrition, and it will develop into an adult human being. In the same way that a baby only needs time and the right environment and nutrition, and they will also turn into an adult. So this was proven a few years ago by a survey from the United States. And this researcher asked the public who should determine when life begins. And 80% of the public said biologists. This is a biological, scientific question. The word biology literally means the study of life. And so he then asked 5,500 biologists, when does life begin? Or more specifically, when does an individual human organism begin? What he found was overwhelming consensus. 95% of biologists said that life begins at fertilization. And just to check that he didn't only find pro-life biologists, he asked them what they thought of abortion, and many of them were pro-choice or very pro-choice. And he found that even among very pro-choice biologists, 70% of them still said life begins at fertilization. And this is why, of course, the medical profession historically has been completely opposed to abortion until very recently in human history. The Hippocratic Oath explicitly says, I will not give a woman a pessary to produce abortion. And the updated Hippocratic Oath in the world, from the World Medical Association in 1949 said, I will maintain the utmost respect for human life from the time of conception. Now they've now gotten rid of this clause because the Western medical establishment has been hijacked by abortion activists. But this is the history of medicine and the precedent that is set before us. So finally, I just want to share some landmarks of fetal development. Now, we have to be clear. Life does not begin at any of these landmarks. Life does not begin when the heart begins to beat. It doesn't begin when the baby can feel pain. It doesn't begin when the baby is viable. It begins at fertilization. But what these landmarks illustrate is that from the very beginning, this is a growing, living, developing human being. And so just after 2 weeks and 2 days, the baby's heart begins to beat, just 2 weeks and 2 days after fertilization. That means by the end of the 4th week, the heart has already beaten 1,000,000 times, and your heart beating in your chest right now has been beating every single second since that moment. 4 to 5 weeks, the baby can begin to move by herself. And at 6 weeks, you can actually measure and record brain waves from the baby with microelectrodes. At 7 weeks, the baby has taste buds in the tongue, and they can hiccup and suck and swallow. At 8 weeks, the baby begins to practice breathing by herself, though of course she's breathing amniotic fluid. And at 9 weeks, the baby can begin to yawn. At 10 weeks, the baby can begin to feel pain, most likely, but some people think this is even earlier. And at 12 weeks, the babies can interact with each other socially. Now, how could we possibly know that? Well, we know that because babies in the womb move their arms around in the womb. And when they move their hands towards their face or their eyes, they slow down to protect themselves. Well, what they've discovered is that when there are twin babies in the womb next to each other, they will move their arms around, but when they move their arm or their hand near to their twin sister's face or body, they slow down to protect her. At 14 weeks, if you sing the baby a song in the womb, she will actually listen and she will begin to move her mouth and tongue to try and sing along as well. At 15 weeks, the baby's begin to respond to specific tastes of food that the mother has eaten. And later in pregnancy, they can even remember those tastes and then remember them after birth. And they prefer to eat that food after birth. So it's a very practical tip that if you want your child to like a specific food, if you want them to eat their vegetables, it's a good idea to eat them during pregnancy because then they already begin to like to eat that food. As another very practical tip, if you want your baby to like a certain music, you can play it during pregnancy and the baby will remember the song and even prefer that music after birth, and they will more likely stop crying if they hear that song. So the baby can even remember the mother's voice and her accent and language in the womb. There's a study that came from Europe which found that French babies, as soon as they are born, cry in a French accent. And as soon as German babies are born, they cry in a German accent. This is not because of genetics. This is because they have already picked up the accent in their mother's womb. And by just 23 weeks inside the womb, the baby is already able to cry. And we'll see a video of that very soon. So finally, this is one of the most remarkable facts about fetal development. This is that when babies are in the womb, from just 2 to 3 weeks after conception, they produce stem cells which go around the mother's body, helping to repair the mother's body from diseases. So they can heal the heart after a heart attack or the liver after hepatitis. They can heal the skin. They can protect against Alzheimer's disease. They can protect against breast cancer and so on. In fact, they even become part of the mother's brain. Now, this means that for a woman who has become pregnant, whether she's had a baby or had a stillbirth or tragically had a miscarriage or even an abortion, there is a good chance that part of her unborn child is still with her for the rest of her life, thinking, thinking in her brain with her. And so many people, or some people, like to suggest that this is why women are more intelligent and make better decisions than men, because they have a bit of extra help from their babies. I don't know if that's true. It's probably just speculation. But it's an incredible picture of a mother-child relationship. This is not the relationship between a parasite and a host. This is a mother and a child in symbiosis. So at the very end, and I promise this is the very end now, I just want to show a few pictures and videos of unborn babies, just so you can see how quickly they develop. This is a baby at 9 weeks in the womb. This is at 11 weeks. This is at 18 weeks. This is at 20 weeks from an MRI scan. You can even see the ventricles within the brain. You can see some of the folds of the brain. You can see that the baby jumps up and down. So if you remember in Luke chapter 1, it said that John the Baptist jumped in the womb when he heard about Jesus. Maybe this is a video of John the Baptist. It's not confirmed. But in my country, it is legal to have an abortion at this stage of pregnancy, 20 weeks, for any reason at all. If you find out that this baby is a baby girl and you wanted a baby boy, it is legal to abort that baby at that stage. The same is true of this baby at 23 weeks. Now, if you're very sensitive, please close your eyes for a moment because this baby is going to feel pain. You can see that the baby has an anesthetic injection and the baby immediately begins to cry afterwards. Now, the reason they're having an injection is because they're undergoing surgery. You can now do surgery on an unborn baby during pregnancy. But to do that, you have to give anesthetic, which causes a few moments of pain for the baby. This is at just 23 weeks of pregnancy. This is the same thing, but at 30 weeks, and so the video is a bit clearer with ultrasound. You see as soon as the injection goes in, the baby begins to cry. You can see the eyes scrunch up, you can see the mouth open, you can see the tongue even in there. In my country, at this stage, 30 weeks, you can have an abortion if the baby has any disability at all. It is an extremely radical law. So some people will say, well, that is just the end of pregnancy in the second and third trimester. But if it's early in pregnancy, in the first trimester, it's just a ball of cells and it's not really a baby. Well, as we have seen, this is not true. We know that life begins at fertilization from a scientific perspective. But also, the baby develops very, very quickly, much more quickly than many people realize. So, I want to show you a video from just 7 weeks of pregnancy. This is in the first trimester when most abortions take place.
By 6.5 weeks,
You can see at just 7 weeks, the baby has the eyes, the fingers are separating, the heart is beating in the chest on the left. They don't have eyelids yet, which is why they're staring, but they grow eyelids soon afterwards. This is a baby at 8 weeks. Just a week later, you can see the eyelids are nearly complete. You can see the nose with the nostrils. You can see the mouth and the tongue. You can see the limbs with the vasculature. You can see the toes even pointing. They look almost as big as mine. And this is a baby at 9 weeks. You can see the eyelids are fully formed. You can see all the blood vessels in the arm. You can see the ears developing. And you can see at the end that the baby covers their face with their hands. And the scientific reason for that is because they don't like the media taking photographs. They're very private people, so they don't want any photos or videos taken of them. Well, I hope this has been informative. I hope you can see why this is so important. This is by far the biggest cause of death throughout the world, particularly in those blue countries where abortion is legal. But Nigeria is not safe just because it currently is pro-life. We know that many abortions already happen, and we know, as I said, that there is millions of dollars flowing into Nigeria through Marie Stopes, through the Gates Foundation, through the WHO, through the UN, through the population agencies, through all sorts of people. All of this money is going towards the depopulation of Nigeria so that there are fewer Nigerian children able to sustain the country. And so it's vitally important that you begin to strategize now and you begin to realize where this pressure is and you begin to raise your voice in an informed, truthful, gracious, and credible way to begin to respond to this pressure. It's hugely important. And of course, I'm very happy to help you do that if I can. So thank you so much for listening again. There are a couple of my websites. There's one with a question and answer section. So if you have any questions, they're all answered at that website. But I would also love to take some time right now to answer some questions. So thank you so much for your time and your patience. And I look forward to answering some questions for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Calum. We really appreciate your time and the presentation you have made. Very elaborate, very robust. Thank you so much. So it's time for our questions. If we can take few questions, few comments for Dr. Calum to respond to. I will also look through the chat box to know if there are some questions there. Dr. Calum can also look through the chat box to see if there are questions to respond to. Thank you.
There's this first question. What is your take on therapeutic abortion? So thank you for that question.
Yes, and there's a hand that
sure. Let me answer this one first, and then we can go to the gentleman with the hand raised. So yeah, this is a very important question, and I'm glad I can clarify. There are situations where, in order to save the mother's life, the baby has to be removed, and therefore the pregnancy ended. So this would be situations like sepsis, if the source of infection is the uterus with chorioamnionitis, some cases of preeclampsia, you need to end the pregnancy, and so on. And so it is true that there are situations medically where to save the mother's life, you have to remove the baby. Now, hopefully, this is after viability. It's in the third trimester, so that you can try and save the baby rather than them dying. But in some very rare tragic cases, the baby is too early in pregnancy to survive, and therefore the baby inevitably dies as a result of ending the pregnancy. Um, when you do this, firstly, these situations are extremely rare when you compare them to the majority of abortions. So in the UK, there are 200,000 abortions every year, and the number that are to save the life of the woman is less than 100. So it's far, far less than 1%. So it's very rare, and it doesn't justify abortion in general. Now, most people, most Christians, historically, and pro life people have said that when the mother's life is at risk, then your priority has to be saving as many lives as possible. Now, the reality is that in most of these situations, if the mother dies, then the child will also die. And so, if you keep the pregnancy going, the mother will die and the baby will die. And so, to be pro life and to save the most number of lives, all you can do is to separate the mother and baby so that at least one life can be saved, even if not both. There's a lot more detail to that, but most pro-life people would say that it is okay to separate the mother and the baby if there is a genuine medical emergency, and tragically, this means that sometimes the baby will die as a result. Some people call this abortion, some people do not call it abortion. So whether it's called abortion kind of depends on the situation and depends on the person, but the situations are real, and everyone agrees that they are permissible and they're legal in every country in the world. Now, the danger is that this category of therapeutic abortion or medically justified abortions is very easy to abuse and to find loopholes. So in my country, the UK, you can only have an abortion if the child is disabled or if the mother's health is at risk. And so what the abortion providers and doctors say is, if this woman has a baby girl instead of a baby boy, her mental health will be at risk, and therefore she can have an abortion for health reasons. So especially when you include mental health, then that actually means you can do an abortion for any reason at all, because you can say that anything is a reason to protect a woman's mental health. And therefore, what normally happens in countries like Nigeria, where the population is generally pro-life, is that they will push forward a bill in the parliament or the Congress, and they will say we are legalizing abortion only for health reasons. So it sounds very reasonable and moderate and pro-life, but they include mental health, which is a gateway and a loophole for abortion on demand. And so what's really important when you think about abortion laws and guidelines and practice is that when you allow these very rare exceptions when the woman's life is genuinely at risk from a physical condition, you have to be absolutely clear in the guidance and in the law and the way it is phrased that this is only for serious medical, physical health problems, and that this does not include mental health issues. Because once you include mental health, or even physical health in a very generic, broad way, it is a gateway to abortion on demand. So ultimately, therapeutic abortion is permissible, but it is extremely rare, and you have to be very careful when you're deciding how to phrase that. So I hope that makes sense, and I hope that is an informative answer. Thank you for that question. And Dr. Ugu, I hope I said that right. Looks like you have your hands up. I'd love to hear your question.
Yes, you said that excellently. And thank you so much for the wonderful talk again. I think I like what you said about responding with truth, but also grace. And even though you give some examples about how Christians have responded in the past, I wanted to find out if you had sort of specific ways in which, for example, we can respond like a CMDA with grace, the grace aspect of it, now that we know what the Bible and the evidence says. And the second one is slightly different. I'm going to ask, what kind of data do you think we still need in our context like Nigeria? You've shared a lot of data. I'm moved a lot by the one that had the voices of the women themselves, sharing ways in which they want to be supported. But from what you think, how can we express grace in this issue as CMDA, and then what kind of data is still required to make a very solid position form? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's a lot that you can do in response, and grace is hugely important and applies both to the woman and the child. So even just by protecting the child's life and advocating for the child and the woman together, that is one way of showing grace in these situations. But of course, you also want to show it to the mother. There are many women who have had abortions and who desperately need healing and forgiveness from that. And so it's really important that churches and doctors are able to explain that the gospel is for everyone. There is no sin other than blasphemy against the Holy Spirit that is unforgivable. And certainly abortion is not the unforgivable sin. So we have to be very clear that this is something that can be forgiven completely and that you can receive healing for. And so one thing that can be done is setting up post-abortion healing ministries, whether using counselors or medical professionals or people in church or whoever else. And at the same time, offering women support before an abortion or before keeping the baby, so that she feels that she has the real possibility of keeping the baby and is able to do that. So doctors have multiple roles in this. I mean, they can give medical care, they can help to give psychiatric care in some cases if that's necessary. They can also use their voice to raise awareness about this, because one of the most powerful tools that you have as medical professionals is not necessarily just your practical skills, but actually your voice and your platform as someone with credibility. And one of the most important things that you can do is to use your voice with church leaders, with politicians, with Ministry of Health people, with other doctors and medical organizations, to say this is a serious issue. We need to be pro-life. We need to take a stance. We need to raise awareness about this. And we need to create as a society places where women in need can go, whether that need is during pregnancy, or whether that need is with a young child at home, or whether that need is for healing and forgiveness after an abortion. And so doctors can use their role as people with credibility and contacts to be able to advocate for these places that women can really get the grace and healing that they really need. So that's the first place to start. And of course, there's a lot of detail when it comes to advocating, and we can talk about that later. The second question, in terms of data, I think the first thing I would say is it's often thought that there needs to be a huge research project and fact-finding mission, and you have to start from scratch. And the first thing I'd say is that this is not really true. Most of the data that you need in order to advocate effectively and to teach and equip effectively already exists. So the beginning of life doesn't change from country to country. International law doesn't change from country to country, and so on. And in many cases, you can get good data and experiences to educate from other countries. So, for example, it is often argued that if abortion is prohibited, then women will still get abortions, but they will have dangerous clandestine abortions and they will die as a result. Whereas if you legalize abortion, you will make it safer and you will stop all of these women from dying. Now, we actually have data from many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, from Zambia, South Africa, Rwanda, some data from, not much, but some data from Ghana and Benin, and so on. So a number of countries in Africa which have legalized abortion, and they show that legalization does not work. it does not stop women from dying from clandestine abortions. And you can use those experiences from countries in the same region, even though it's a big region, to inform your advocacy in Nigeria. One of the things that does change quite a bit from country to country, and which is really helpful to have data on, is why exactly are abortions happening? What is the thought process that goes into an abortion? And what could be offered to women to prevent that from happening? So, either for women who have had abortions or considering abortions, if we could get survey data asking them, what would it take for you to be able to have your baby and finish your pregnancy? That would be really helpful because it would allow us to form a targeted research-based response with grace to women who are in those difficult positions. So rather than just coming up with support packages that women might not actually need, if we have a better understanding of why abortions are occurring, then we can target our responses so that we're actually meeting the needs of women in that situation. And so that would be a particularly helpful research project in Nigeria specifically. So I hope that's helpful. Thank you for those questions. I see there's another question in the chat. Please continue to put your hands up if you want to ask a question out loud. But the next question in the chat: how about abortion of a fetus upon prenatal diagnosis that shows a congenital abnormality that will make life unbearable for him or for her? This is another very good question. Now, remember what I said in the talk, which is that there are these. Sorry. Okay, I'll carry on. There are these rare situations where people think abortion is more justifiable in extreme situations, but they're very, very rare. So these situations where the child has a congenital abnormality account for 1.5% of abortions in the UK. It's just over 1%. It's very rare, but it does still happen. And so a lot depends on the specific diagnosis. Sometimes this is a really life-limiting condition like anencephaly or Patau syndrome, something like this. Other times it is something like Down syndrome, where the child actually has a good life expectancy and is very happy. And so people used to do abortions for Down syndrome because they said that the children are very unhappy, they suffer a lot, they have no quality of life. They still do abortions for that reason, even though we have many, many studies of people with Down syndrome and their families, which show consistently that people with Down syndrome have very happy lives on average. They're very glad to be alive, and they also enrich and give joy to the people around them, especially their families. So often we can make assumptions about how bad someone's life is actually going to be. And in reality, life is usually not that bad. In fact, for some cases like Down syndrome, the average person is happier than someone without Down syndrome. Now, there are cases where you would expect more suffering and the life expectancy is much shorter. What we have found in countries like Italy, where they have a lot of perinatal care and perinatal hospice, is that firstly, the answer to this for the baby is not to end the life of the baby. Normally, to perform an abortion at this late stage of pregnancy, after you've discovered the disability, you have to use an excruciatingly painful abortion technique, which involves feticide. This means that you take a needle, you stick it through the abdomen of the woman, and you stick it into the heart of the baby and inject it with high-dose potassium chloride. Now, all of us know that potassium chloride is used in medicine all the time. It's not necessarily painful in low doses, but in high concentrations that they use, it is excruciatingly painful. In fact, you cannot use potassium chloride in veterinary medicine for euthanasia for pets. So you cannot put down an animal using potassium chloride unless they have been made unconscious. And they are also advocating to eliminate it from capital punishment because high-dose potassium chloride is so painful. But the way they do these late-term abortions on disabled babies is to inject high-dose potassium chloride directly into the heart of the baby. So it's excruciatingly painful and certainly is not a compassionate way to reduce suffering. It doesn't reduce suffering in general. And so what we found is that the best response is to try and promote good perinatal care and hospice care if needed, so palliative perinatal care. And there are some wonderful institutions and organizations which have been able to create good palliative care for babies, even if they only survive for a few hours or days. And these are able to eliminate the suffering of the child without eliminating the child themselves. And so this is a much better answer, but it's also better for the woman. And this sounds really unintuitive because many women want to have abortions in this situation, and it seems cruel to make them go through the pregnancy. But again, when you look at the actual scientific evidence and the psychiatric evidence, there have been studies of women in this situation. And what they have found is that if a woman has an abortion for a fetal disability, she considers it torture. She says it was one of the worst things in her life. She thinks she will never be normal again. But if a woman keeps the baby in the situation, of course it is still tragic, and of course she still has a lot of grief because the child passes away quite soon, and it can be very difficult. But 98% of those women, according to the statistics, say that they would make the same decision again. They say those few hours that I had with my baby were some of the most meaningful and amazing hours of my life, and I would do the same decision every time. And I could share a lot more about that. I won't because we have limited time, but all of that is to say we can often make huge assumptions about how people respond in these situations, and those assumptions are often false. All we need to actually do is listen to the stories of women who have been in these situations, who will almost always tell us that, yes, my child has or had a disability, and in some cases suffered quite a lot as a result of that. But they were still a human being. It was still my son or my daughter who was made in the image of God, who also had a lot of great joy and who gave me and our family great joy. And their life was precious and valuable. And if they did have suffering, then the best way to get rid of that is to eliminate the suffering rather than to eliminate the child. And so I hope that's a helpful answer to that question as well. Thank you.